It's with great pleasure to have Caroline Pennec here today. So Caroline is a political economist. She has a PhD from University of Berkeley, and her work is basically she combines modern text as data tools and applies them to questions related to political economy. She's done a lot of work with text data from political manifestos, from French political manifestos, and this paper, this project, together with Julia Cachet and Elisa Mugin, is sorry, is one of those. And well, Caroline is happy to take questions in between, either in the chat. I mean, if someone posts a question in the chat, as usual, we might let Caroline know that there's a question there, and otherwise just raise your hand or shout out. Thank you very much, Caroline. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction and for giving me the opportunity to present that paper, which, as you said, is joint with Julia Cagé and Elisa Mougin on money and ideology, evidence from candidate manifestos. So the role of money in politics has been widely investigated already. In particular, the impact that campaign spending can have on electoral outcomes, or the returns that donors may expect from their political donations. But we know very little about the possible influence of money on ideology and political speech. So it could be that the case that campaign contributions affect the things that candidates choose to talk about during their campaign and the information that they give to voters before they choose whom to vote for. And these effects may depend on where the money comes from and the identity of the donors. It may also vary across candidates from different party affiliations and from different ideological leanings. So in this paper, we study the impact of corporate donations on the content of campaign communication. To do so, we construct a novel data set. We collect 2 pages manifestos that are issued by all the individual candidates to the French parliamentary elections. And what I will focus the most on this talk is the analysis of these manifestos, which we carry through text as data methods. And we combine this textual data with very detailed data on the campaign revenues and the contributions received by these candidates. And for causal identification, we exploit a national ban on corporate donations, which was passed in France in 1995. And we use a diff in diff approach by focusing on the 2 elections that were held around the ban. So the election before the ban in 1993 and the election after the ban in 1997. And we also look at heterogeneous effects across different parties and different types of donors. So as a preview of the results, we find that corporate donations do influence electoral discourse. They encourage candidates to advertise their local presence in their manifesto. And this is particularly the case for the donations that come from small, local, and non-partisan corporate donors. We also find that these donations have an effect on the policy topics that politicians choose to focus on. They tend to push discourse toward economic issues in particular. And we also find that these effects are stronger for the candidates of non-mainstream parties. So like more niche parties and extreme parties or independent candidates who are not affiliated with any party. And for these more like marginal candidates, we also find a moderation effect on the polarization of their discourse. So we then discuss different possible mechanisms that could rationalize these empirical findings. And the one that we find the most likely, which is also more novel, is what we refer to as an electoral effect. So the idea would be that donations affect political discourse because they have an effect on the perceptions that politicians have of what their voters care about the most. And so because their beliefs and their voters' preferences change, the politicians also adjust the content of their campaign communication accordingly to persuade these voters. So in terms of contribution to the literature, well, we contribute to a very vast literature on campaign finance and political connections. But while existing papers have mostly focused on the impact of campaign contributions on electoral outcomes or legislative behavior or public procurement contract, we are the first to estimate the impact of donations on discourse and expressed ideology. Second, we also contribute to papers on campaign messages, which have been found to matter to voters. And in this paper, we show that the donations and the identity of the donors may influence the content of these campaign messages. And finally, we also contribute to a growing literature that uses text as data in economics. So for the rest of the talk, I will give you some details about the institutional setting and the data. Then what I will focus the most on is the methodology that we implement. And then I will hopefully have time to show you some results and discuss some of the mechanisms that we consider. And then I will conclude. And yeah, as we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, you don't hesitate to interrupt me if you have any question. Okay, so the context that we are looking at is France, which has been through a series of campaign finance reforms starting the end of the 1980s. So in particular, since 1990, candidates can raise money to run their campaign, but they have to do so under pretty tight scrutiny. So legally, they can only start raising money a few months before the election. And after the election, they have to report to a national commission all their sources of revenues and all their expenses. And if they have any funds remaining after the election, they have to give them back. So they cannot stockpile money in anticipation of future elections. So that's quite different from the US context, for instance. So really raising money for French politicians has to be very election specific. And in 1995, the reform that we are the most interested in is an unanticipated ban on all donations from legal entities. So this is what we refer to as corporate donations in the rest of the talk, as opposed to individual donations, which are donations made by individual people and not by corporations. So this ban on corporate donations was passed between two legislative elections. So these legislative elections are quite similar to the congressional elections in the US, for instance, in the sense that we have close to 600 districts in France, and each of these districts will elect one representative for one seat in the parliament's lower house. So we have, yeah, I think there is a question.
Hi, Caroline. I'm just wondering, you might be talking about it later on, but what is the institutional background to this ban? Was there a particular reason why this ban was introduced? Maybe we'll talk about it. Maybe I'm jumping ahead a bit.
No, I was not planning to talk about it, so it's good that you asked the question. So it was so it was unanticipated, as I mentioned, in the sense that France was going through this series of reforms to really impose a legal framework on how campaigns should be financed and how political parties as well, actually. So before 1988, it was kind of like the Wild West. Like there was no rule there was not even like a. So let's say that because there was no rule, we had no idea what was going on, and we had no idea where their politicians were getting their financial means from. And at the end of the 80s, they decided to rationalize it and to introduce some more formal rules. And to make it such that these donations from private companies and from individuals would be encouraged, but under some scrutiny, some public scrutiny. But there was a series of scandals preceding the 1993 elections that broke in the media. And so there was a general, suddenly kind of a reverse of going from reforms that would impose a legal framework, but would encourage donations, from just reverting back and deciding that no, we should ban all corporate donations. So, yeah.
And there is an independent election commission, kind of a body which imposed the ban? Right.
Yes, absolutely. So this is this agency, which has this very long acronym, So that's a national commission that
Right, okay.
candidates have to report all their expenses and revenues to after the election. And that commission will verify that everything is follows the rules. If not, candidates can be fined, etc. And this is also the commission from which we actually get the data that we use. Okay. So to get back to the more like electoral context or like the electoral rules, so I was mentioning, so we have these districts, we have 1 seat per district, and we have on average 10 candidates per district running for that 1 seat. And one feature of the French system as well is that candidates may run affiliated with a party, which is the majority of them, but we still have about 30% of the candidates in our sample who choose to run as independents. So they are not affiliated with any party. And finally, a very important feature for us as well is the fact that in France, candidates can issue their own campaign manifesto before the election, which is distinct from their party manifesto. And so these manifestos are 2-page documents that are mailed by the state to all registered voters a few days before the election. So if you are a French voter, you would get in your mailbox a few days before the election a single envelope that contains all the manifestos from the candidates running in your district. And because these manifestos are mailed very late in the campaign, they are basically mailed after most fundraising activities have been done by the candidates. So here is an example of such manifesto. So this is 2-page document, as I mentioned, which usually would have a picture of the candidate, and then sorry, I have something in my throat. And then some text, which the candidates can use to to say whatever they want to the voters. So either like mentioning the policy platform of their party or advertising their own qualities as politicians, for instance. So one thing to keep in mind when we think about the content of these manifestos is that we are looking at parliamentary elections, so that candidates that we are interested in are running for a national mandate, even though they are competing at a local level in their district. So there is a tension for them between following the party line in their campaign communication and persuading the voters who are their local voters in their specific district who may not support that party platform. So candidates are somewhat limited and constrained in the type of things that they could possibly advertise in their manifesto, but there are like 4 interesting dimensions of language that we believe they have control over. So first, they could choose to campaign on national policies or decide to address to advertise their ability to address local issues instead and insist more on their local presence. They could also decide to run a more or less partisan and polarized campaign. They could choose to focus on some policy topics from their party platform more than others. And finally, they could decide to use a template that is common to all the candidates from the same party, or to issue a more personal and more original campaign manifesto instead, which we will use as a proxy for the quality, the overall quality of their communication. So for this project, we collect the manifestos that were issued by more than 10,000 candidates, both from 1993 and 1997. So the ones from 1993 are from a previous paper of mine, and the ones from 1997, we collected and digitized the paper version of the manifestos from the National Archives. So before I jump into how we construct these different measures of language that we are interested in, I just want to mention briefly what the data that we use on the contribution side. So to look at campaign contributions, we use data on the aggregate spending and revenue of all candidates. And we complement this data by very detailed information on the corporate donations specifically. So this data is from the National Commission that I've mentioned, to which the candidates have to report all the donations that they received and the identity of the corporate donor. So we find that about 1/3 of the 5,000 candidates who are running in 1993 received at least one corporate donation. And so in our sample, we have 14,500 single corporate donations with an average value of 2,000 euros each, knowing that they were capped at about 10,000 euros. And so we can use the name of the corporate donor, which the candidates have to report, to identify the unique donors among all these donations, because some donors may make multiple donations to different candidates. And so out of these 14,000 donations, we find 10,500 unique donors. And so first takeaway, very descriptively from this exercise, is that most, like a very vast majority of donors in our sample are what we refer to as small donors, in the sense that they make one single donation to one candidate. And another interesting fact is that out of the multiple donors who give to multiple candidates, we find that 70% of them give to candidates both on the left and the right. So it seems like the donors overall in our sample are not very partisan. Okay, so if there is no question at this stage, I will jump to the methodology. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, Paul, is that me?
Yeah.
No, Pushka.
Go ahead, Simon.
Okay, Caroline, I just had a question. It seems a bit of effort that the candidates have to put in to make a manifesto, another one, to be sent out. Do all of them take advantage of this? Is it considered that they have to do it, or do some just say, oh, our campaign is bigger than this mail out, we are fine, I couldn't be bothered? Could you say something about the choice, voluntary nature of this and how many people comply?
Yeah, sure. So it's actually very, so they don't have to do it, but really like the vast majority of them do it. It's costly in terms of in terms of effort and the time spent on like writing the manifesto. But in terms of financial cost, it's actually not that costly, because for candidates who would make more than, who would get more than 5% of the votes in the first round, the cost of printing these manifestos will be fully reimbursed by the state. And then, so in terms of the effort that they have to put in, there is actually, we see quite some difference on that across parties. And so that's something that I will mention briefly later. But indeed, it seems like, and that's why we use this notion of originality as a proxy for the quality of the manifesto, because indeed, writing a very personal message says something about how much work the candidates put into writing the manifesto, as opposed to just taking the party manifesto and copy pasting parts of it. So that's also an outcome that we are going to be interested in. And I think, Pushka, you had another question?
Paul, you were before me. So go ahead, Paul, then I'll ask the last one.
Okay, thank you, Pushka. Just a quick question regarding whether you have anecdotal evidence on the quid pro quo idea between, so as a politician I give to as a company I give to a local politician, is the idea that I can influence local policy, or by spending that money influence federal level policy, or is it both, or is it unclear?
Yeah, so I would say that so we do explore the potential role of these quid pro quo effects on as a potential mechanism for the findings that we have. So I would say that the data that we have is not ideal to try to prove the existence of such quid pro quo relationships. What we are able to do, I believe, is to show that it's probably, even if they exist, this is probably not these relationships that are driving the effects that we see at the campaign stage. But I won't be able to completely rule out the existence or not of these quid pro quo relationships. And then I think that your intuition is right in terms of what, if there were such relationships, what would the donor expect from their politicians, the politicians that they give to? And I think we don't have hard evidence on that, but intuitively we believe that what they could be looking for is some local influence that the national representative can exert even at the local level. So even if those are national representatives, they are still pretty influenced potentially in their local district, and they could somehow use their connections to convince mayors to give public contracts to that company versus that other one, for instance. So those are the types of maybe quid pro quo relationship that we may expect to exist.
Paul's question reminds, it's almost like the opposite of the clientelistic pattern of vote buying, right? It's the other side. Is the corporate giving money to the candidates as opposed to the candidates giving money to the people, as we see in traditional developing countries. So anyway, I had a good question slightly differently. We always know that the corporates play both sides of the politics, right? So I'm wondering, is there a pattern kind of, obviously they won't be giving money to competing candidates in the same constituency, right? So do you have any sense of the pattern, way in which they contribute across constituencies in terms of who they want to support?
They can give to, and we find that
really? Okay.
Many of them give to candidates,
to
multiple candidates in the same constituency. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's possible.
They're competing against themselves almost, right?
Yes. So one.
No.
Yeah, I guess there are several explanations, but you may expect that like donors, like either they have these political connections with several politicians, if we believe in reciprocal relationships, or it could be that they just like, there are several candidates that they like and several candidates that they want to support, and so that's why they give to multiple candidates in their same district. Okay, so let me now jump into the methodology aspect of the paper. So we are going to use several methods from computational text analysis to construct measures that are related to the hypotheses that I mentioned before. So first, we construct a measure for the prevalence of local references over national references. And for each of these measures, I will give more detail about how we construct that in a moment. Second, we construct a measure of the partisan leaning of discourse from left to right. Third, we construct a measure for the prevalence of different policy topics in the manifestos. And finally, we construct a measure of the overall originality of the manifesto relative to other manifestos from the same party. So our first measure is an index for the prevalence of local references over national politics. So to do that, we use a simple dictionary approach where we count the frequency of local references that a candidate makes in their manifesto by counting the number of times they refer to the department in which they are running, which is the local geographic area in which they are running, and any municipality from that department. We do a similar exercise to count the number of times a candidate refers to more like national politics by counting the number of times they refer to parties or to specific national prominent politicians, so like the members of the government or party leaders, or specific like political landmarks at the national level. And then our local index is a simple log ratio of the frequency of local reference over national references. So to give you some like visual description of what that outcome looks like, here I am plotting the kernel density of this local index for candidates of different parties separately. So each line corresponds to the density of the local index for one of the 5 main party organizations running over our sample period. And as you can see, within party, there is quite some variation in this local index. So some candidates would prefer talking about local issues versus national ones more than others. And there is also some heterogeneity across parties. So for instance, we find that the far right candidates, which is that curve on the left, do tend to, the local prevalence in their manifesto is much lower than for other parties. So the far right candidates would be much more like nationally focused and much less locally focused in their communication. So that's for the local index. Then our second outcome is a measure of the polarization on the left-right scale. So to construct that measure, we use a supervised scaling approach, which is based on the party affiliation of the candidates, which we know. And more precisely, we adopt the multinomial inverse regression framework introduced by Matt Paddy, which is what is used. Some of you may know the paper by Matt Gensko and co-authors on polarization in the US Congress. So we basically adapt their methodology to the French manifestos context. So the idea here is that, so first we do some pre-processing of the text, which is classical in this literature. So we remove stop words, we lematize the vocabulary to reduce each word to its semantic root. And we restrict the vocabulary to words that are used by at least 0.5% of the candidates to remove words that are too infrequent, and at most 50% of the document to remove words that are too frequent. So that leaves our vocabulary with about 4,000 words. So then how the multinomial inverse regression works is the following. So we regress the frequency of a given word in a given document on a dummy variable, indicating if the candidate is from a well-identified right-wing party versus a well-identified left-wing party. So the coefficient on that dummy variable is what is referred to as a word loading in this framework. And it gives us an indication of how much more likely that word is to be used by a left-wing candidate versus a right-wing candidate. So it's the measure of the polarization of the word. And to estimate these many coefficients, we have to deal with the very high dimensionality of the data. So the fact that we have, several thousands of words, and therefore like several thousands of these coefficients to estimate. And so we do so using a penalized estimator that will shrink the coefficients that are too large and too noisy. So that basically reduces the influence of words that are too rare. So a possible source of bias from these estimators is the fact that some words may be identified as being very polarized just because they are randomly used by a few left-wing candidates and never by any right-wing candidates, even though they don't have any real polarization meaning. So the penalized estimator allows to reduce the risk of such finite sample bias in the estimation. And so finally, once we have estimated these word loadings for all the words in our vocabulary, we construct a candidate level score, left-right score, by just taking the average of the loadings of the words that the manifesto contains. So to show you some what the method gives us, so at the word level, here I'm just listing the words that are identified as being most left-wing versus the most right-wing. And we see that it does make sense. So on the left, we have words like dividends, poverty, benefits, that are related to more social economic policy. We also have words on anti-democratic, disarmament, because especially in 1993, there was still the end of the Cold War. So this was still a topic that the parties would debate about. And on the right, we have words relating to security, like terrorist, murderer, criminal, and also words referring to independence from Europe in particular, like Europe, foreigner, independence, identity, etc. So this shows that our method kind of makes sense, at least intuitively. And a next piece of evidence to validate it is to check what the density, what the distribution of these scores look like on the left-right space by party. And there we see, so this is a similar plot to what I have shown you before. But this time I'm plotting the density of the left-right score by party. So here, a negative score means refers to a left-wing score, and a positive score refers to a right-wing score. So we see that something that is not mechanical is the fact that the communist candidates and the green candidates do tend to use more left-wing language than the socialist candidates, who are known to be more moderate on that political space. And similarly, we see that the far-right candidates use a much more right-wing language than the more moderate conservative candidates. Yes, Simon, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Caroline. Could you just go over again how you generated the labels? So you said that the well-known left, well-known right, their words were your...
yes, so yeah.
That text or those words, those documents were your polls in this analysis. Could you tell me how you selected those? So
I use the manifestos themselves, but I aggregate the manifestos for all the candidates who are affiliated with a party that is known to be clearly on the right. And same thing on the left. So that would exclude centrist candidates and independent candidates whose ideological leaning is not known. But the reference texts are based on the manifestos themselves.
Okay, so if affiliated with this pole of the left, all those documents went in. If affiliated with pole of the right, all those documents went in, and then that creates the label set.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's a great transition with my the next outcome, which this time is about the prevalence of different policy topics. In particular, we focus on 4 large policy topics, which are Homeland and Administration, foreign policy, economic issues, and social issues. So here to determine the relative weight of these topics in a candidate's manifesto, we use a similar supervised approach, but this time we cannot use the manifestos themselves as our reference text to train and to estimate the word loadings that we want, because we don't know ex ante which manifestos are more likely to talk about economic issues and which ones are more likely to talk about social issues. So for this outcome, we adopted a slightly different strategy where we are going to use the written questions to the government that elected politicians can issue to specific members of the government to raise some concerns of their constituents about specific topics as our training set, basically. And the advantage of doing so is that because each question that the elected representative issues is directed to a specific ministry, we can determine what kind of policy this ministry is about, and therefore use the questions to the government, which we scrape from the Parliament's website, to identify which words are most associated with one topic versus the other. And to determine how words relate to these different topics, we use the same multinomial inverse regression framework. So very similar to what we did to scale candidates on the left-right space, but now instead we kind of scale each candidate on a topic-specific scale. And we use these latent topic dimensions that we uncover from the text to estimate the probability that a candidate will focus more on economic issues as opposed to the other issues. And there, to give you some illustration of how the method works, we do find that, again, like the specific topic keywords that we find for each topic do make sense, which is reassuring. So for Homeland and Administration, we find that the most predictive keywords are things like vote by proxy, because the ministries of the Interior, which is also the Homeland Security Ministry, is also in charge of the organization of the elections. So we had a lot of words referring really to the electoral rules themselves. But we also find words like police, passport, etc., so much more related to national security. For foreign policy, we find words about diplomacy and United Nations. For economic issues, most of the words are really related to market regulations. So think about some specific rules for the retail and the banking sector, for instance, and also words related to economic policy like taxation. And for social issues, most of the most predictive keywords relate to public health or education. And then in terms of the average prevalence of these different topics in the manifestos, we find that manifestos mostly focus, the most prevalent topics tend to be social issues, followed by economic issues, and then a little less of Homeland and Administration, and even less of foreign policy. But again, there is quite some wide heterogeneity across parties. So for instance, here I'm plotting the density for the prevalence of economic issues for each party separately. And there we can see that the far right party, for instance, really distinguishes themselves by having a much lower density of this. The distribution is much more skewed, suggesting that they talk about the economy a lot less than other candidates. But if we look at a different topic, like Homeland Security and Administration, then we see a very different pattern where there, on the reverse, the far-right candidates tend to talk a lot more about Homeland Security than candidates from the other parties, and in particular the Green candidates, who don't talk so much about Homeland Security. So again, this exercise helps us kind of validate this measure and make sure that it does make sense intuitively, given the context, the political context that we know of. And finally, our last textual outcome is this originality index that I mentioned before. So to construct it, we use a method called latent semantic indexing. So here the idea is to represent each document as a vector of words frequency. And more precisely, we use TF-IDF weights, which are measures of frequency, but that give a higher weight to words that would be very frequent in a given text and not very frequent in the other text. So it's more a measure of like how document specific that word is. And so that gives us a documenter matrix representation of the corpus, where we have this very large matrix with one row per document and one column per word for the 4,000 words in our vocabulary. And so we apply some single value decomposition to that very big matrix to reduce its dimensionality to 200 dimensions. And then we use that dense matrix to measure the similarity between each possible pairs of documents within the same party. And the originality index that we construct is defined as the mean pairwise negative similarity between a manifesto and each other manifesto issued by a candidate from the same party. So basically, a candidate with a very low originality index would be a candidate running for using a template that is common to many candidates from the same party. So to give you, I'll give you an illustration in a minute. First, I'm showing you the same thing, the density plot for this originality index for each party separately. And here again, the far right is quite distinct from the other parties in the sense that their originality index is much lower than for other parties, suggesting that far right candidates are very not original in their communication and tend to use a template common to all candidates from their party. It's also the case for the Green Party to some extent. And that's not surprising because we found, and that's also just from like anecdotal evidence after reading a lot of manifestos, that there is indeed a big difference in terms of the marginal candidates or the candidates from very small parties that would really just use a template common to all candidates, sometimes without even personalizing the name of the candidate. And the more like serious candidates, I would say the ones with like better chances of winning from the more mainstream parties who do write like much more personalized manifestos. So here is an example of two manifestos from the far right party who would have a very low value for their originality index. Because as you can see on this picture, they're basically use the exact same format for their manifesto, and they do change the name of the candidate, hopefully, and the picture, but otherwise that little paragraph over here is exactly the same for both candidates. So this is an example of like non-original manifestos where candidates use the same template in the same party. And this is quite different from this other manifesto for that candidate still from the same party, from the far right party, but who issued like a much more original and personal manifesto where at least the format is different and where the content is also different. So is there any question that I may have missed about these textual outcomes? If not, I think I have 20 minutes left, so I will, that gives me time to actually show you some results. Before that, let me tell you a bit about the empirical strategy that we implement to estimate the causal impact of corporate donations. So the first thing to note is that, as we may expect, corporate donations are not randomly allocated across candidates. So here on this figure, I'm plotting the coefficients from regressing the amount of corporate donations received in 1993 on different candidate characteristics and on their party affiliation. As we can see, women are less likely to receive corporate donations than men, but incumbent candidates and candidates who are also mayors do tend to receive more than others. And then in terms of party affiliation, we find that the two candidates from the two mainstream parties, so the Socialist Party and especially the conservative right-wing party, do receive a lot more donations than independent candidates, which is the omitted category here. And conversely, candidates from the Communist, the Green, and the far-right parties tend to receive less. Oh, I see that there are some questions in the chat, so maybe I missed them. Sorry, I guess.
Oh, it's just a comment. You can ignore it for now.
Okay, I'll look at it later.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, so the challenge is to try to identify the causal impact of corporate donations, knowing that they are endogenously allocated across candidates. And to do that, we exploit the national ban on corporate donations, which was passed in 1995, which was unexpected, as I mentioned before, and which indeed created a real shock on candidates' revenues. So here on this figure, I am breaking down the total revenues of candidates by looking only at candidates who ran both in 93 and in 1997. But I do that breakdown separately for the candidates who did not receive any corporation in 1993. So those are the candidates on the left, and for the candidates who did receive some corporate donations in 1993. And those are the candidates on the right. So we see that for these candidates, the corporate donations that they received in 93 accounted for about half of their total revenue. The other sources of revenues being individual donations, so donations from people, party contributions, so contributions from the candidate's party, and personal contributions, which refers to candidates using their own money to self-finance their campaign. And we see that in 1997, of course, the share of corporate donations falls to zero because now they are illegal. And so the revenue of these candidates also drops substantially. So that we are going to exploit that in a definitive framework. So our main specification is the following. So we are going to regress each of the textual outcomes that I've presented before on the amount of donations that was received by the candidate, which can be positive in 1993, but which is always going to be zero in 1997 after the ban. And we control for candidate fixed effects, for party-specific time trends, and for candidate characteristics that may change over time and which were found to correlate with corporate donations. So our identification assumption is that the within candidate trends in campaign communication within the same party are independent from the corporate donations that candidates received in 1993. So let me now show you the results from estimating this specification. So first, we find a significant and quite large effect on the local index. So we find that a 1 standard deviation increase in the corporate donations that candidates receive tends to increase the local prevalence in the candidate manifesto by 16% of a standard deviation. And we find that this effect is driven both by an increase in the frequency of local references, but also by a decrease in the frequency of national references. But it's really mostly coming from an increase in the frequency of local references. So it's about candidates mentioning departments or municipalities in their departments much more often. So probably advertising their local presence a lot more. So next, we do not find any significant impact on the left-right score of the candidates or on their extremeness, where the extremeness is defined as the absolute score, the absolute value, sorry, of that left-right score. So it measures like how far you are from the center. But the fact that we have this null average effect is actually masking quite some large heterogeneity across parties. So here I am showing you the results from estimating the same regression, but interacting the amount of donations received by the party affiliations of the candidates. And here we see some interesting patterns. So first, we see that the impact of the local index is positive and significant for all mainstream, for all candidates, including the mainstream candidates from the socialist and the right-wing parties. But it is especially strong for small parties, like the Green Party, for instance, for which the effect is really huge. And for this party, we also see a positive and large effect on the left-right score, suggesting that donations push green candidates toward the right of the left-right scale in their language. And as a consequence, because green candidates started from the left in the baseline, that results in a moderation effect. So their extremeness is decreased by donations. And we see a similar pattern for far-right candidates with a strong effect on their frequency of local references. And although it is not significant, we have in size a similar effect on their extremeness, suggesting that donations may also, though it's a bit noisy, may also push far-right candidates to moderate a bit their rhetoric. And we also have this that pattern for independent candidates with a very larger effect on the frequency of their local references and some smaller but significant moderation effect. So, and the last set of our main results is about the prevalence of these different policy topics that I've mentioned. And there we find that donations tend to increase the prevalence of economic issues, and they tend to decrease the prevalence of social issues and foreign policy. And we also find that these effects are actually larger for the niche parties like the Green and the far-right candidates, and for the independent candidates who are not affiliated with any party. So to summarize the findings, we find that corporate donations do encourage candidates to advertise their local presence and also to talk more about economic issues. These effects are stronger for the non-mainstream candidates, which are also the candidates for which we find some moderation effect in terms of their polarization on the left-right scale. And finally, I haven't really mentioned it yet, but we also have a positive, although smaller effect on the originality of the manifesto. The reason why I haven't mentioned it so much is because we actually find that that result is not very robust, and it's much smaller than for the other outcomes we look at. So we consider 3 possible mechanisms that could rationalize these results. So first, it could be coming from a resource effect, from a quid pro quo effect, and from an electoral effect. So let me just, given the interest of time, I will just jump into the description of each of these possible mechanisms right away. So first, the resource effect hypothesis is that, well, corporate donations represent extra revenue. So when candidates receive these extra resources, that gives them the financial means to run a better campaign. So that could explain why we find a positive impact on the local prevalence of in language, possibly because like the extra money coming from corporate donations allows candidates to run more research on the local issues of their district, or maybe to hire some campaign staff that would help them write a more personalized and more local message. But this interpretation is not very consistent with the limited impact on the originality of the manifestos, which we believe would really be the best proxy for the overall quality of the campaign communication. And it's also not consistent with some heterogeneous effects that we find across donors. So we find that this effect on the local prevalence is primarily driven by the small and local donors. So these donors that we mentioned before, which are referred to as local in the sense that they give to multiple candidates, but within the same district. And this effect is also mostly driven by non-partisan donors, so donors who give both left and right. So the takeaway from this heterogeneity exercise is that receiving corporate donations is not the same as receiving any money. So there is really an effect that seems to be specific about the identity of the donors and where the money comes from, which is not consistent with a pure resource effect channel. So instead, another mechanism that we consider is the quid pro quo effect that we've already mentioned a little bit. So this is the idea that politicians may pay back their donors and serve to serve their special interest. So this mechanism would be consistent with the increase in local references in response to contribution from small and local donors, because we may expect these donors to have specific local interest that they're hoping that the politicians would serve better. And we also find some heterogeneous effect depending on the sector of the donors, and we find that the effect on the local prevalence are particularly driven by corporations from the environment and the energy sector, which is sectors that rely a lot on public contracts. So this would also be consistent with this quid pro quo effect mechanism. So the reasons why we are not, our conclusions are only mixed about that possible mechanism is that if this was really the main driver of the effects that we see, we would expect the impact of donations to be even stronger on discourse among elected politicians, when the politicians are actually in power and when they can exert influence to help their donors. So to test for that, we use the same written questions to the government, which we have used to train our policy topic method. And we also scraped the interventions that the elected MPs make during legislative debates to test whether we see the same effect of corporate donations on the prevalence of local references in their discourse once they are elected. And there we do not find the same pattern at all. And finally, something that is also not consistent about this mechanism is that, as I've shown you before, we find that the stronger impact of donations is really on these marginal candidates who have virtually no chance of being elected, so who are the ones with possibly like very little influence and probably not very able to help their corporate donors in any way. So although the evidence is mixed, we believe that the campaign stage effects that we see are unlikely to reflect the future political favors that politicians would make to their donors, and that there must be another mechanism explaining the large effects that we see on campaign communication. So that's why we come up with that third possible mechanism, which we refer to as an electoral effect. So here the idea would be that donors are not necessarily looking for a payback or for quid pro quo relationship, but that they just give expressively to support the candidates that they like. And that for the candidates, engaging in these fundraising activities and making connections with corporate donors may affect the perceptions that they have about what their voters care about. And so they adjust their campaign communication accordingly. So this is consistent with the fact that the contributions from the local donors would push candidates to advertise their local connections and their possible knowledge of local issues. And also the fact that corporate donations push candidates to focus more on economic issues. And especially, so I haven't shown you that result, but we also classify or like measure the prevalence of more narrow policy topics in language. And we find that the effect on these economic issues is really driven by local economic issues, like construction and amenities, for instance. And that interpretation is also consistent with the fact that we see a stronger impact on the non-mainstream candidates, because we may expect these candidates to have much less precise prior beliefs on the voter preferences, as opposed to more mainstream candidates with more experience. And therefore, these non-mainstream candidates may respond very strongly when they receive any signal of what their voters may actually care about. And so one possible consequence of that interpretation is that it may reveal the existence of cheap talk or very short-lived effects in campaign communication, given the fact that candidates may adjust their campaign messages to persuade more voters to vote for them. But then, as we don't see any effect on their discourse when selected, it seems that this adjustment in their campaign communication does not translate in actual policy making afterwards. Okay. So I see that there are also more questions in the chat, which I have missed. Sorry, but I can either like
maybe those people who posted questions, do you want to ask them verbally to Caroline?
Well, Caroline, mine was just a suggestion, which was about the Originality Index. I'm not sure if you've looked at word embeddings, but they will actually give you contextual information about the words and therefore building up to the document level. And that might be a different pipeline to try to get something more robust around your similarity measure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. So we actually tried using, so we tried different approaches than this latent semantic indexing approach, including using word embeddings. The reason why we focused on the more simple approach that is less demanding on the data side, I would say, is because, well, to train, I guess our corpus is not big enough to train our own embeddings reliably. Like a vocabulary of only 4,000 words is too small to get embeddings of good quality. And we could use pre-trained word vectors, but then the risk is that like the corp around which actual current vectors have been trained are very different from political language in the 1990s in France. So we didn't find like any big, if I remember correctly, like all these measures were correlated with each other. It's just that we found that the more simple approach that we used was somehow easier to defend than using embeddings that were of not great quality, I would say.
Just another thought would be that you could possibly use a clustering approach. So if you, so I know that you've done it versus the party affiliation, which makes sense in terms of the templating. So I wonder, but alternatively, you could allow an unsupervised clustering approach to identify the locations of the seminal clusters, so to speak, for all the documents, and presumably the far right will have a very strong association around that. And then that would give you those locations, those kind of locations, and then you could look at the distance to the nearest one and also check whether it's actually the one that you think it should be, or actually if it's an amalgam, a mixture of different ones, because that would also present more of a novelty or more of a, like it has no particular strong like affiliation. Whereas if it lands very strongly and closely to some cluster, then this will be an indication that it's probably drawn from that template most strongly, other than looking ahead or around. It's just another way to think about it, and using tools which are able to look at all the data rather than just subsetting to the party, related ones, which doesn't allow you to learn from the others.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We haven't tried that, and yeah, that's definitely. Thank you very much for the suggestion. Yeah, I think.
Just a thought on. So, given that I like the idea that the explanation that it could be just or mainly public relations kind of effect from the companies, and I was wondering whether you could support that statement or interpretation with data, in a sense that if it's really public relations and you have local firms, I mean, it's competing for attention from local consumers or whoever, whether you could use local market structure and have an idea, if you have two firms in the same industry in a town, they might compete for the public relations space in this area. And maybe that has an effect on the amount of donations. So if, on the other hand, if you have a local monopolist, they might give a little bit because they have to, it's expected, but maybe less than if you have some competition. Or maybe there's even, I'm pretty sure there's already some literature out there in political economy or political science that looks into that kind of competition in the PR space.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We haven't done that either, but I think, yeah, like try to relate these firms to maybe, like how big they are basically in the local market, or like how much employment they represent or something like that.
Yeah.
Could be a very nice exercise. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I think Aishan, you also had a question.
Hi, Caroline, thanks. Am I right to understand that the corporate donation is coming from the corporate treasury rather than some political action committee like in the US? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. So there's no political action committee.
So one tough question is, I wonder to what extent corporations substitute with like personal donation from manager and from the owner, and to what extent a possible channel being, yes, the donation from corporation has been reduced to zero because from the treasury they cannot donate anymore, but now they substitute with a smaller amount of donation from manager and owners of corporation. But because previously corporation donate to all candidates, and so now even if the absolute amount of donation becomes smaller through the private channel, the marginal impacts, the marginal electoral impact of a $1 or €1 donation become larger now. It's just because previously they were in some sort of prisoner dilemma. They are like the donation cancel each one out, and then the ban would means that everyone now has to make a smaller donation, but the marginal impact of the €1 donation become larger, and that give the owners and manager a greater bargaining position in terms of influencing policy, and that shift that focus on the local. So it's some kind of mix between the electoral channel and the quid pro channel.
No, I think I understand your point, which is mostly about like, is there really substitution between these corporate donations and indeed these individual donations, which are still allowed after the ban? And we actually expected to see that we would see a shift, and that because now that corporations cannot give as corporations, they may still be able to give as, you know, like the owner of the company may still give as an individual contributor, as you just said, but that's actually not what we see. So we see some substitution effect between corporate donations and individual donations, but it's not that large, and the larger substitution effect is actually coming from party contributions. So it seemed that what happened is that after the ban, these candidates who are relying on corporate donations a lot, they see like a big drop in their revenue, and it's their party that's coming to compensate for that, as opposed to individuals.
I see.
So even though there is still some substitution with individual donations, it was really not as strong as what we expected. And so we are fairly confident that the ban was a real ban in the sense that like it did really eliminated some contributions that happened before. They were not just like transferred or like masked as being something else.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks for that's a great question. Okay, so I don't know how am I doing on time. I'm actually over time, I think.
Oh, so, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, so maybe I can just conclude and then take other questions if people have more. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So to very briefly conclude, oh no, what did I do? I clicked on the wrong button. Okay, my apologies. So to conclude, in this paper, we provide some evidence that corporate donations do influence campaign communication. They tend to encourage candidates to advertise their local presence, and they push candidates to favor some policy topics over others, including in particular economic issues. We also find that the identity of the donor matters, as our effects are mostly driven by local and non-partisan donors. And we also find that these effects on campaign communication are larger for the non-mainstream parties. And in particular, because of this moderation effect that we see, it suggests that corporate donations tend to push the more marginal and extreme candidates to fall in line and to look more like mainstream candidates, basically. And one possible policy implication of our results is that banning corporate donations, or just like campaign finance regulations in general, may have an effect on the expressed ideology, on the political discourse of politicians, and that these effects may not necessarily come through like the quid pro quo relationships that may exist between politicians and donors, but also through some effects on the politicians' beliefs about their voters' preferences. And now I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Are there any more questions?
8, 9, 11.
So if no one have any questions, can I ask? So based on sort of the conclusion, am I right to infer that, well, if that is the channel, we don't really need to ban the corporate donation, we just need make a limit on it, like so everyone cannot contribute more than 300 euro, and so so corporate will still have this sort of politician can still update their belief about the constituents, and they cover a more modest cover proposal.
Yeah. So it's hard to draw. So that's why I don't want to push too much on kind of like the normative implications of the findings. I don't think we want to claim anything about whether we think that corporate donations are good or bad per se. What we show is that they do have an effect on something that was not really considered as possible consequence of donations before, which is the things that politicians talk about and how they campaign and the information that they make available to voters before voters cast their vote. Then whether like these effects are a bad thing or a good thing, I think it's hard to tell, especially because we don't see any effect at the elected stage. So it's hard to conclude that donations do impact political agendas in the long run and have real like policy effects. So in a sense, this discrepancy between campaign effects and policy effects would suggest that maybe donations are actually encouraging like kind of like cheap talk and push candidates to advertise things that they would not really act on once they are elected. So in that sense, maybe yeah, there could be a bad thing or like something that is undesirable in terms of voter welfare. But on the other hand, our setting is not the best to test for any policy effects, because again, like we are looking at these national representatives who are very constrained by their party discipline. Once they are in office, they vote on bills like their political group asks them to. And so there's very little like margin that they can work on, like let's say that there is little that donations could make on the policy side. And the fact that we see like these politicians adjusting to them, and especially adjusting toward like writing these more personal, more local messages that suggest that actually these donations, maybe they are helping voter welfare, like helping democracy by sending some signals to the candidates about what their voters care about, and like making them just like more informed about what their electorate, where the median voter would be in their electorate. So it's really hard to draw a clear conclusion, I think, from these results.
I see. Yeah, makes sense. Thanks a lot for the interesting talk. It's a really nice paper. Great talk. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and thank you very much everyone for the great suggestions. And if you have any more, like you are very welcome to email me, and I will be very happy to stay in touch.
$60.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Caroline. That was a fascinating talk, pretty exciting. I've already told a few people who couldn't make it that about the paper and the recording. So yeah,